All right, good afternoon, everyone. I see 12 o'clock on my watch, so we're going to get started. My name is Christine Woody, and I work with Empower Missouri, and we're the organization putting on this webinar call today. We normally here in the St. Louis area have these forums once a month. It's on the third Friday of the month, and we usually meet at Paraquad, and we have lunch together, and we talk about and learn about a specific social justice, social welfare issue that we're working on. So in light of what's happening, we moved it online, and we're able to open up to everyone across the state instead of just the St. Louis area. So I'm glad there's so many of you that can join. The way that it's going to work is I'm just going to do a quick little introduction of some stuff, and then I'll pass it on to our two speakers. And during that time, I'll probably try to mute everyone. If you've never done a Zoom call before, there is a button where you can unmute yourself. And there's a function on here where you can chat. So if you do have a question while they're presenting, feel free just to type it into the chat box, and then I can pass it on to them. But after done of the presentation, we will do some question and answer where I'll open it up for everybody, and we'll be able to do more kind of question and answer that way. But while they're presenting, I am going to try to mute everyone just because of all the background noise that everybody's in their house. And if something isn't working or you're not talking and you're on the phone and you can't do the chat box, I want you to feel free to send me a text message, or you can send me an email, and I can try to work with you to get it figured out. So my phone number is 314-503-7277. And my email is christine@empowermissouri.org. So if you can't get to the chat box because you're on the phone and you want to send me an email or a text, I'm happy to help you that as well. So normally on these meetings, we do continuing education credits for social workers. It's a little different when it's on a webinar where we can't collect your data specifically, but we still can give out a certificate of attendance that you can use if you're trying to collect continuing education hours. So feel free to send me an email or put your name and email address into the chat. And after this is over, I can send you a PDF of a certificate that says that you attended this meeting that you should be able to use for CEUs. Originally, when we were supposed to all meet in person, the first thing that we were going to do during this forum about voting rights and voter suppression is we were going to watch the powerful documentary called Suppressed. I believe in the emails that went out about this event, there was a link to that documentary that you were able to watch online. Hopefully all of you were able to do that, or you can do that here in the next couple weeks or so, because it really is a powerful documentary that's really eye-opening, and was what most of the topic was going to be about, was talk about voter suppression and voter rights and all of that. And so we've shifted a little bit in light of what's happening now, and really going to focus on kind of protecting the voter and protecting rights during this pandemic time. But we will talk a little bit about the film and about just voter suppression in general. So I really hope that you'll watch that documentary when you get a chance. But we just didn't want to take time to all watch it together on this time, because I know Zoom calls can get a little long. So we wanted to get right to the heart of what we're talking about today. So we do have two wonderful speakers that were able to join us today, and I'm going to do a quick introduction for both of them, and then we'll just jump right into their presentations. So first, I'm going to introduce to you Denise Lieberman. She is a civil rights attorney and is nationally recognized expert on voting rights. She was the director of the Power and Democracy program at the Advancement Project at their national office in Washington, D.C. She's a faculty director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative here at Washington University, and she also coordinates the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition. And you may have heard of that coalition in the midst of a lot of elections where they organize the hotline calls, and they monitor polls, and they work with hundreds of volunteers on every election day to make sure that people's voting rights are being protected. And then the next person we have on our speaker reel today is Representative Trish Gunby. She represents St. Louis County in the Missouri House of Representatives, and she was just elected in a special election in November of 2019. Before she was elected to legislative service, she was a full-time activist and an engaged citizen on lots of issues, a lot of them regarding human rights and safety. So she helped organize district-wide voting programs. She was the leader of the West County Community Action Network's voting rights team. She served on the board of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, and she's done a lot of work on voting rights and protecting voter rights. And hopefully she's going to share a little bit about what she's been hearing with the state legislature about some of these issues in the past, and then moving forward in light of what's happening. So I want to thank both of them for speaking today. And I believe Denise is going to go first, and she has some slides that she's going to share her screen with us for. So I'm going to mute everyone now. And then if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. And I will unmute you at the end so we can do some question and answer. All right, Denise, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. This is Denise. Thank you so much. And thank you to Empower.
All right, I think I just deleted.
Hi, nope,
Okay.
I'm good. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Christine, for the lovely introduction. Thank you to Empower Missouri for hosting these forums. I've enjoyed participating in a number of these Friday forums in the past, and we're now taking this to a different venue. And so this is exciting, and it's really exciting to see 95 people on this call on such an important topic as protecting our democracy. And so my name's Denise Lieberman. I'm a voting rights lawyer. Been working statewide and on the national stage for some years, last 13 years at the national level as the Director of Voting Rights at Advancement Project National Office, while also here in Missouri coordinating the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which is a statewide network of approximately 50 organizations, including Empower Missouri, that work to protect the right to vote and fight against barriers to access for voting. And the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition has been doing this since 2006. It emerged initially to fight restrictive photo ID proposals in the state, and has again emerged in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis as a leader in helping ensure access to the right to vote in Missouri. And so last week, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition released its policy recommendations to ensure access to voting in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these recommendations were drafted in consultation with national voting rights experts like myself, with a particular eye towards the nuances and specifics of Missouri's election law and Missouri's election practices. And so they were also crafted in consultation with Missouri advocates, Missouri election officials, and Missouri voting rights experts. So I'm going to share a little bit about what that call to action is and sort of what we're doing about them. Okay, one second. All right. And Christine, I think you might be unmuted, and I think we're hearing some background noise. There we go. All right. So as I mentioned last week, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition released its measures to ensure voting in Missouri amid the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, this pandemic has far-reaching consequences for so many aspects of our lives, and in particular, our ability to access voting. And we've seen examples across the country as various primary elections have been postponed, as various court challenges have required certain voting to go on. For example, in Wisconsin a couple weeks ago, we watched probably in great concern as the court required voting to go forward, refused to allow a number of absentee ballots to be counted. And we saw that in Milwaukee, for example, They reduced the number of polling places from 180 polling places to just 5 in the entire city, and watched people standing in hours-long lines and crowded conditions that really put voters and poll workers alike at risk. And we know that without access to widespread testing, the CDC has made clear that everyone is at risk, and that even asymptomatic people can carry the disease. And that's, of course, the basis behind the various stay-at-home orders and the recommendations of the CDC that people engage in social distancing. And so I'm going to tell you the plan here for our recommendations. So in light of what I just shared, first and foremost, we know that states around the country, including Missouri, need to be prepared for a dramatic expansion in voting by mail. And here in Missouri, we're not a vote by mail state. There are 5 states in this country that do vote primarily by mail. We're not one of them. But we do allow in Missouri for absentee voting by mail. However, in order to dramatically expand that, there are some challenges. Missouri is one of just 14 states that requires all voters to have a particular excuse to avoid going to the polls on election day. Our law says that everyone has to go to the polls on election day unless they can list one of 6 reasons to avoid going to the polls on election day. Now, fortunately, one of those reasons that you can get an absentee ballot in Missouri is due to illness or confinement. Now, the challenge is that there's been no determination about whether practicing social distancing, staying home due to fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 constitutes an illness for purposes of being able to vote absentee. And of course, we have called on Secretary Ashcroft to issue guidance to local election authorities saying, yes, social distancing, staying at home, fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19, regardless of whether you have a positive diagnosis or whether you're symptomatic, should constitute a valid reason to vote absentee in the state of Missouri. However, Secretary Ashcroft, and we've also called on Governor Parson to issue an executive order consistent with that directive. Neither have done so. Secretary Ashcroft has said he's not going to take a position on whether fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 constitutes a reason to get an absentee ballot. And so what that means is he's left that decision to local election authorities. There's 116 local election authorities in the state of Missouri, and they're all applying the law just a little bit differently, in some cases to opposite results. So for example, the election director in Jackson County, Missouri said, absent showing symptoms, fear of contracting or spreading the virus is not a valid reason to vote absentee. Whereas the election director in St. Louis County said it is. And in some cases, other election officials have said, well, you can vote absentee, but only if you're in one of the high-risk categories. Another election official said, yes, COVID-19 will be a valid reason to vote absentee for the June municipal elections, but maybe not for the August municipal elections. And so they're all over the place. And so we are preparing to, there will be litigation brought in court to help clarify that and ensure that all voters have access to the same set of rules. So importantly, the first guideline here is that Missouri needs to prepare for expanded voting by mail and ensure that all voters are able to cast an absentee ballot to avoid going to the polls on election day. However, voting by mail alone is not enough. We know that that many populations don't have ready access to the mail. In particular, people who may be housing insecure, voters with disabilities may have to vote in person. Disproportionately low income communities of color may have challenges accessing voting by mail. And so there need to also be options available for people who don't have ready access to the mail or have challenges getting that mail processed. And so our measures also call consistent with CDC recommendations for voting for expanded in-person absentee voting to ensure that we can, again, flatten that curve, disperse crowds that might normally show up at the polls on election day to allow them to vote in advance of election day, as long as those places are operating consistent with CDC guidelines for polling places. There are actual recommendations out there that the CDC has released on exactly how polling places should operate in the midst of this crisis. Third, because Missouri is going to experience dramatic increases in absentee voting by mail, and this is going to be true regardless of whether the lawsuit results in a statewide ruling or not, we know that there will be dramatic increases in voting by mail. Voting by mail is dependent on accurate voter rolls, right? So if your address is not right, then that piece of mail isn't going to get to you. And that could result in potentially being disenfranchised. And so it's absolutely critical that people have ready access to tools, particularly online, to register to vote and to update their voter registrations. Because so many of the processes that we normally see during presidential election years like this one, to register to vote, voter registration drives, having voter registration booths at community fairs, festivals, parades, the door-to-door canvassing, all of those things where people often register to vote or update their registrations are simply not going to be happening. And the Secretary of State's voter registration portal is less than user-friendly and needs to be enhanced, and there needs to be assistance provided to all voters to ensure that those voter rolls are timely updated so that everybody's able to actually get that mail. Fourth, polling place modifications. So again, voting by mail alone is not a solution because it does leave people out who don't have ready access to mail. And again, those are disproportionately going to be voters with disabilities, low-income voters, disproportionately communities of color, people who may have moved. We're seeing all kinds of additional fallout from this pandemic, people losing their jobs, people potentially getting evicted. And so there are going to be a lot of issues with that. So, and we also know that particular community studies show that particularly communities of color have less confidence in voting by mail compared to white voters, and they need to vote at the polling place. And so we are recommending that Missouri election authorities adopt the polling place modifications that have been outlined by the Centers for Disease Control that are specific to polling places and ensure sort of a range of sanitation and hygiene and social distancing measures. Fifth, robust voter education. This is absolutely critically important, and this is where all of us can play an important role because voters are going to need access to information about new voting processes and assistance in being able to cast those ballots. So for example, we know that there'll be polling place changes, right? We know that election authorities are going to move polling places from places that might be vulnerable, like say senior centers and schools and things like that. Voters need notice of those polling place changes well in advance of election day. Voters also need information on how to cast absentee ballots and do so in ways that ensure that their vote will be counted. And this is a role that not only election officials have to play, but community advocates like ourselves as well. And this is something that's really important because while many states around the country have been moving to more voting by mail, Missouri's not been one of them. In the 2016 presidential elections, about 25% of ballots were cast by mail nationwide. However, here in Missouri, that was only about 5%. And so it's just not something that we're used to doing, and it's not something that people here know how to do as well. And so that robust voter education is really important. It's also going to be critical for election officials to take a very affirmative stand and combat misinformation that's out there that can generate confusion and can ultimately deter people from voting. So these are some of the measures that we have called on various actors in their official capacities to undertake. And this involves a whole range of leaders, right? There are certain things that lawmakers can do, and I know Representative Gunby is going to speak to that, and that includes helping ensure, we've called on lawmakers to ensure that in the supplemental budget and in the COVID relief package that they're going to be looking at when they return at the end of April, to ensure that there are funds allocated to provide local election authorities with the funds they need to administer what is certainly going to be the most challenging election for all of them to administer, including the increased costs and new policies they're going to have to undertake to ensure full access to absentee ballots. We've also called on Governor Parsons to judiciously use the emergency powers that are vested in him as a result of the state of emergency we're under, to ensure that all voters have access to ballots. And we've called on Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, who has the power to issue guidance to election authorities, particularly about applicability of absentee voting. And he can also issue directives to local election authorities on application of the law. And we've called on local election authorities as well to step in and provide that robust voter education and assistance. I want to be clear here that these are measures that we are calling on lawmakers to make as a result of the current crisis, and that we're calling on these measures to be undertaken for the 2020 election cycle. But this is not to discount, and is part of course, a much broader campaign to ensure voting in Missouri. One of the reasons that we're facing the challenges we are in Missouri is because our voting laws are so antiquated. Though currently 34 states in the District of Columbia don't require voters to have an excuse to vote absentee. If we were among those states, we wouldn't be facing the problem that we're facing right now, right? Currently, many states already allow for early voting. We don't. If we were one of those states, we wouldn't be facing some of the access problems that we're having right now. And so because of that, I'm going to also plug a petition that is being spearheaded by another one of our coalition partners, Jobs with Justice, calling on these broader measures to be undertaken on a permanent basis. And this is something we've been working on for years and are going to continue to be working on as we head into the next legislative cycle and into the next election cycle as well. Other things that you can do. I'm going to include a link in the chat. First, you can join the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition in signing on to these recommendations, in particular to ensure that all Missourians have access to the vote in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. Already, these measures have been signed on by more than 50 nonpartisan organizations from throughout the state of Missouri, including Empower Missouri, including Jobs with Justice, including the NAACP and the ACLU, the Sierra Club, National Education Association, a number of faith-based organizations, social service organizations, organizations that work with voters with disabilities. I'm going to include the link as well for you to sign on to those. And finally, I invite you to join us. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition meets weekly, Mondays at 10 a.m. And we've been having pretty robust discussions and in bringing on national experts to talk about, in particular right now, issues of voting in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. We brought on national voting rights experts from the Brennan Center and the Lawyers Committee to talk about the national recommendations. We brought on leaders from the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, which is lobbying at the congressional level to get additional funds allocated to the states for state infrastructures for elections that would then ensure some of that money could be funneled to our election administrators. We have brought on members of the Missouri General Assembly. Minority Floor Leader Crystal Quaid was our guest speaker last week, and we're bringing on local election officials as well. So to get those notices for the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, you can text MOVPC to 66866 and you'll be put on that email list. And I think I will, there's a whole lot more that we can talk about with respect to voting, but I'll save that for the question and answer. And I'll stop there. I think that was about 10 minutes or so. Well, and I'll just say this actually as I conclude. These elections are going to go on. And so don't believe any sort of hype about that elections in 2020 are going to be canceled. This is a presidential election year. This is perhaps the most important election cycle of our lifetimes. Voting has always continued, even in the midst of crises. So it does mean that voting is going to change somewhat, but it's going to go on. Voting occurred during the Civil War. Voting occurred during the flu pandemic of 1918. Voting occurred during World War I and World War II. And voting is going to occur again here in 2020. I am absolutely 100% confident that we can ensure all people have access to voting and that people will not be disenfranchised because of this pandemic, but only if we start and work now to ensure that everybody does have access to a ballot this year.
Thanks, Denise. Go ahead, Representative.
Hi, everybody. I'm Trish Gunby. I'm in the 99th District out in West County, Manchester, Twin Oaks, Valley Park. So that gives you kind of the footprint. Happy to be here today. Voting is one of the reasons I ended up running. Ran in a special election last November. I'm new at this job, only been at it 2.5 months, and then we were sent home. So truly an historic time. I've spent the better part of the last 2.5 months, 3 months, just trying to learn the building and not get lost, to learn the protocols. But more importantly, I have been very working hard to really meet Republicans and work across the aisle. We are in the midst, as you know, it's a supermajority. They hold the cards to how things go down really in the chamber, what makes it to the House floor, what even makes it to committee. I actually went online, and anybody can do this. If you go to Missouri House of Representatives, there's a link, a listing of all the bills. You can click on the subject matter, and if you go to elections, you can print off or read all the elections/voting bills that were filed this year. There were 78. Oh, wow. And they were really split, sort of like the state is. About half were filed by Democrats, half were filed by Republicans. Of course, the nature of what was filed, that's kind of where the differences are. But the thing I think that's really interesting about all of this is that virtually none of these have made it through committee and onto the House floor. And my belief is that is because voting is really not a priority, certainly not making it easier to vote. And I think that's demonstrated by the legislation that has moved through before we were sent home. Really, the only thing that we debated at all was some had to do with photo ID and driver's licenses and those kinds of things. I actually, the only two times I spoke on the floor, one time was to talk about photo ID. And when I challenged the bill's sponsor about his legislation and documented used data from both more conservative voting rights groups and more progressive voting rights groups, and asked, do you dispute the data that I'm sharing? It had to do with voter fraud, voter impersonation fraud, which hardly ever happens. And I was told, basically, I don't really have data around that. I just have a sense that it happens. And if I think it happens, it's probably happening.
Wow.
And I'm really not kidding about that. You can go back and look at the archive. The argument is used. It's an opinion based, not data based. And so it's difficult in this scenario to argue using facts when those around you are not using facts. But so what does that mean? Well, it still means that those of us who are in the minority, we try to take a stand on the House floor. We do so through social media. We make friends, as I said, across the aisle. We try to find ways to impart our belief system, and that's what I've been trying to do. Aside from that, we don't know what is going to face us when we go back next week. We're being told that it's going to be a budget to deal with COVID-19 and to prepare us for our fiscal year, which starts July 1st. And our minority leader, Crystal Quaid, has asked that this not be politicized and that we go back and we truly talk about that and we don't try to pass any legislation in this time. But I don't know if that's not going to happen. There is Senate Joint Resolution 38, which made it through the Senate to undo Clean Missouri, is likely heading our way. We don't know until we get there what's going to happen. But that particular resolution would undo Clean Missouri that we voted on in 2018. It would take away the nonpartisan demographer that is supposed to be hired. It would return things back to the way districts, ways they used to be drawn. It wants to count or not count perhaps children and non-citizens in the drawing of those districts. So the idea that you use census data to draw districts, and last time I checked, kids grow up and they vote, but you're not going to count them this go around. So there are lots of ways that groups are going to be disenfranchised should that resolution go through. What it would do is it would go back on the ballot, and then we'd have to vote yet again, even though 62% of all Missourians passed Clean Missouri back in 2018. So I hope that that kind of legislation, we don't see that. We're limited on the House side as to how long we can talk and debate these issues. If we get cut off and that happens, we just go to a vote, and there you have it. And I don't know how we're going to vote, because when we voted on the supplemental budget, we were cloistered in our offices with our PPE. We all got masks when we came in. Our temperatures were taken, and we sat in our offices and listened to the speaker and some leadership, those in leadership positions on both sides of the aisle. We just listened. We decided to pass the budget only, the supplemental budget, and we were called in groups of 4 onto the floor. And so I only saw a handful of people the day I was there. It will be very challenging to try and debate and discuss anything once we're brought back if we aren't able to be together on the House floor. Because, you know, that's where you just get a sense of there's something to be said for being in the room together, and body language, and, you know, all of those things that come into when you're having a discussion about something so serious. So I don't know how this will unfold. We won't know more until likely we get there, or right before we arrive. And then we just have to deal with that, you know, once we're there. But I want folks to know a couple of other things. When the mail came in last week from the St. Louis County Election Board, in terms of being able to vote absentee because of COVID-19, our household got one. My husband's already 60. I will be 60 this year. And so that's why I got one. But I have talked to constituents, and it's the first time I've heard people actually giddy about voting. They were excited to get their letters. They sent their applications back. It doesn't mean you don't have to take them in and get them notarized, the ballot, once, you know, you send it in. I then followed up with a call to the St. Louis County Board of Elections, and I actually reached out to Rick Stream, who is the Republican portion of that group. Eric Fay is the Democrat that I normally talk to, and I thought, you know what? I talk to Eric all the time. I know where he stands on all this. I'm going to talk to Rick Stream. And we actually had a lengthy conversation for 30 minutes about this issue of the voting absentee. And he said that the Board of Commissioners, the Election Board of Commissioners, have been talking about ways to make it easier to vote. And they were anticipating not necessarily COVID-19, but they had things in place so that when this happened, they were a little bit ahead of the game. And that's one of the reasons you see St. Louis County doing what they've already done versus perhaps other parts of the state. So that's a really good thing. So the fact that they're talking about it, that's a good thing. I did question the no excuse absentee voting, because there are a number of different things we can obviously do to make it easier to vote. Some things in Missouri are more realistic and achievable than others. So just changing no excuse absentee voting is probably one of the easiest things that we could do. And I asked him about that, because he said he was not for expanding that. And I said, I'm trying to understand your mindset around that. And he just shared with me that his idea of absentee voting is when his mother or mother-in-law, who is confined to a nursing home, can't get out to vote. And that's what his mindset is. And there's 13 hours in a day to vote, and everybody should be able to find time to vote. So I think what we need to do, knowing that, and there are likely many who feel that way. So I think what we need to do is to try and make folks realize. I was sitting and thinking about that, and I thought, well, there used to be a time where it was not easy to shop for food for your family. You went to the butcher, you went to the baker, you went to all these different places, and you bought food for your family every day or every couple of days. And that changed over time with refrigeration and grocery stores and all of that. And so we have made things easier to do. Voting is one of the things that we have not necessarily made easier to do. So I think that is the challenge. And know that when the St. Louis County Board of Elections resumes their regular meetings in person, as citizens, you can attend those meetings and you can make a public statement. And I believe that that is just as advantageous as being in the legislature, if not more so. When before I was elected, I was doing voting rights work with West County Community Action Network, or WECAN. I was co-leading voting rights with Jake Lionfields. And we went and spoke with a group in front of the St. Louis County Board of Elections. We were part of a lawsuit that helped set aside photo ID in the special election that I just won in. that was all done as a citizen. It was not done as an elected official. So do not think that you cannot make as big an impact as people who are elected, because it's just not true. So anybody out there, I would encourage you to connect with the St. Louis County Board of Elections, reach out to Eric Fay or Rick Stream, and even expand our reach beyond St. Louis County. I was made aware of the county election clerk in Boone County, Brianna Lennon, and she is posting things on her Twitter feed about allowing all voters to cast ballots by just, it isn't obviously, you don't exempt all age groups, you just let 60 and plus do that. So expanding that to all age groups, but then having some other creative ideas, approve the use of absentee drop-off boxes so that they can return their ballots to election authorities. Create a statewide online absentee ballot. So I think we need to almost, and I know Denise does this with the whole Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, but I think we can still reach out to other county election officials, because there's just, I think when you go to certain areas, there's just a mindset. We've always done it this way. This is the way we've always done it. And it's just hard to break through that. And so I think it behooves us to kind of push from outside our region and to encourage folks to look at other ways to make it easier. Because for me, voting is the great equalizer. And if you can't vote and if you can't make it easy, then you're excluding large populations of folks. And it's apparent that the current administration, I believe, both in our state and nationwide, voting, making it easier is not a priority. So that is why I will just continue to defend our rights to do that and try to figure out ways to drive home our point and educate people. Denise's piece about voter education, that's a huge, huge piece, because there's still people who think that I go to Washington, D.C. So there you go. That's okay. I think that's
maybe one day, Trish. Maybe one day.
But I think that's part of our jobs, is once you have the information, it's our responsibility to share that with friends and family, colleagues, all of that, and to just get folks to understand how important 2020 is, not just at the state level, but certainly at the national level.
Thanks, Representative. I appreciate it. Denise, I think you mentioned it a little bit in the chat, but there has been a couple questions about the notary in terms of absentee ballot. Like, is there any advocacy that can be done to not require that? Or you said something about that it's not required for illness. So maybe for just a minute or two, talk about the notary aspect of this.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, in Missouri, you have to state a reason to vote absentee, but illness or confinement due to disability is a valid reason. And like I said, we're going to be seeking a statewide order to ensure that fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 falls within that reason. That is one of the, while most absentee ballots have to be notarized, not all of them do. And there are certain exceptions. And if the reason you're casting your absentee ballot is because of illness or confinement, it does not require a notary. In addition, if you are on the permanent absentee voter list, that also does not require a notary. And also military and overseas absentee ballots don't require a notary. And so we will be seeking an order to ensure that COVID-19 constitutes a valid reason to vote absentee under that illness or confinement reason, which already is exempt from the notary requirement. And certainly believe that notary requirement needs to be disbanded in the wake of COVID-19. Obviously, social distancing and the closures of businesses in places where people might otherwise get something notarized is going to make notarization not just dangerous and making people put their health at risk, but frankly, it might not even be possible. And it's also time consuming and can be costly. So, so that is certainly the primary goal here, is to ensure that any voter in Missouri is able to cast an absentee ballot without having to undertake the notary requirement. And I'll just sort of jump on a couple of things that Trish mentioned as well. You know, we've been talking with elections officials that want to help provide other ways for people to return absentee ballots other than just through the mail. So the Dropbox idea, there's currently nothing in law that would prohibit for turning in absentee ballots. Right now, for example, if I get an absentee ballot under existing law, I can walk in and hand it to the office. There's nothing in law that says that I have to actually hand that to an actual human being that I'm within 6 feet of. So there are ways to allow people to return those absentee ballots that could still maintain social distancing guidelines.
Denise, my name is Patty Berger. I'm with an organization called All of Us or None in St. Louis. I heard the word confinement. Is that including jail, pre-trial, prior to being convicted of a crime?
So that's actually a reason you can vote
I can't hear you. You're going in and
that
out.
Missouri law allows you to vote absentee. And okay, hi, can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. There are 6 reasons that people can vote absentee in Missouri. One of them is that you're incarcerated but still retain the right to vote. So for anyone who is in pretrial detention, who has not been convicted, who has not been convicted of a felony, they retain the right to vote, and they are allowed to vote absentee under that provision. We do believe that the state needs to take additional measures to make absentee voting more accessible to those populations. There's actually legislation that was introduced and heard by the House Elections Committee this year that would require jails to facilitate getting those absentee ballots to people who are in pretrial detention.
That was my next question. Thank you.
I just want to add a couple of things about the, I did follow up with the Secretary of State's office in terms of the electronic notary, and they have received applications for that, but they don't have anything in place yet. So that's something that they are working on, an electronic notary. And I also want to mention there's another group, a bipartisan group called Show Me Integrity, and they have an online petition as well that's directed at medical professionals to sign, so that folks encouraging absentee voting. So from the perspective of medical healthcare professionals encouraging it. So if you or anybody you know is in that field, and they are obviously our heroes during this whole pandemic, feel free to go to Show Me Integrity's, the advocacy group's Facebook page, and they have the petition available there that you can sign.
There was a question or a kind of just wondering, I think you talked about this a little bit, that a lot of these changes don't have to be made legislatively, correct? So that the governor or Secretary of State can make some of these changes, that doesn't actually have to go through the legislative process. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it certainly, in particular, in response to the declared state of emergency. So here's kind of where things, obviously, if we're going to make any permanent changes to state law, so if we were going to permanently say, hey, we should become one of those 4 states that have absentee voting. If we're going to do that, the legislature would have to pass that law. Okay. However, there are things that other leaders can do as well. So for example, the governor, we are currently under a declared state of emergency. The governor's issued a declared state of emergency. As part of that, he has some emergency powers that allow him to suspend or change current state laws that are necessary to protect people in the wake of the emergency. And so, for example, he's already done that a few times. He's issued several executive orders, one of which applied to elections. He changed and postponed the April 7th municipal elections. We were all supposed to be voting a week ago today, last Tuesday. So he issued an executive order under that emergency power, postponing the April 7th elections to June 2nd. So we have argued that that could also allow him, for example, to declare that COVID-19 is an illness for purposes of voting absentee and allow people to vote absentee, for example. The Secretary of State has certain powers as well. And even though it's sort of maybe not as many as you might think, given that he's the state's chief elections official, since most of the way that elections are actually administered happens at the local level. But Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, as the state's chief elections official, can do a few things. One, he can issue guidance. So he could issue a statement to local election authorities with respect to absentee voting. He can also issue emergency rules as long as they're consistent with current law. And so, for example, after the photo ID law was passed, he issued some emergency rules about how that was going to be implemented. He's issued emergency rules about provisional ballots. He could issue emergency rules about absentee voting. He can also issue directives to local election authorities. So, for example, he could issue a directive to local election authorities telling them that people who request to vote absentee due to COVID-19 should be able to cast absentee ballots without a notary. But again, he has stated that he does not intend to do that. And that's what's creating the disparity of results across the state. So, in short, if we're going to change the law, that's lawmakers. That's people like Representative Gunby. But there are certainly things that the governor can do during a declared state of emergency. And there are things that Secretary of State Ashcroft can do to a limited extent in his role as the state's chief elections official. And local election authorities themselves have quite a bit of discretion in deciding how to carry out elections. And, they're the ones that make decisions about where our polling place is going to be located. How are we going to set up those polling places? What kinds of communications are we going to send to voters to notify them of the rules? What sorts of assistance are we going to make available to people? So there are things that all those folks can do.
Well, and I do want to add that Rick Stream did say that they had reached out to Secretary of State, especially in the municipal elections that were changed to June, encouraging everybody to be able to vote absentee. Simply, one reason is because it's a nonpartisan election, and it was declined. So, there were attempts made at our more, our local level to do that, but obviously if they're not going to change it for a nonpartisan, they certainly aren't going to change it come August or November. But so there were attempts made, at least.
Right. And so that's why, I think it is going to come down to probably a court order saying that COVID-19 constitutes a valid reason to vote absentee that would then apply statewide.
Right.
There was a question and concern about some thoughts that President Trump shared about cutting funding for the Postal Service. Have you heard any more about that? And will that affect any of this? And is there a chance that that might happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there really isn't an institution that hasn't been economically impacted by this crisis. The Postal Service as well. I was part of a national call yesterday with Ben Hovland, who is the chairman of the United States Election Assistance Commission. And fun fact, he's also a Missourian and a former Deputy Secretary of State under former Secretary of State Carnahan. And he said he had been in communication with the Postal Service about this very issue, and said that they are not sounding the alarm about fearing their ability to process and get the mail going with respect to absentee ballots. But I'm going to note this, though, because there's one thing in Missouri law that does concern me about the mail, and that is when you vote absentee in Missouri, that they're going to mail you your ballot, and you have to mail it back. And again, most of the time you need a notary, but if you're casting a ballot due to illness or confinement, no notary is required. But that ballot still has to be received by the local election board at the close of polls on election day. And many states, instead of saying that ballot has to be received by election day, they say, well, that ballot has to be postmarked by that deadline. And that's a real important distinction, because if you measure it by when something's postmarked, then, the voter's done what they need to do, and they're not then harmed by something that's outside of their control, like say delays in the mail. And that's exactly what we saw happen in Wisconsin, with thousands and thousands of ballots ended up getting delayed in the mail. Not everybody got them in time. And so if that would be another area that our recommendations call on the state to address, and that is making that deadline a postmark deadline. It's already what we do for voter registration right now. Voter registration deadline is based on when you postmark it, not when it's actually received.
Can I add a couple of other things? I was looking at my notes when I talked to Rick String. We have in the area 400 polling locations. I asked him about the concern given COVID-19 about poll workers, because so many of the poll workers are in that demographic of over age 60. There are 3,000 poll workers, and there is some concern around that. I even asked him about the possibility of limiting the instead of requiring folks to volunteer for 14 or 15 hours, could you do 2 shifts? And he said that there was an attempt to do that a number of years ago before he was on the board, but their experience in that was that the second shift did not show up, many of them, and so it left first shift workers to work. So I was just trying to kind of find, other ways that we can kind of work around all this. So those were some things I wanted to share. The other thing is I want to do a shout out to Denise's group, the election protection group. If you aren't standing outside a poll for your favorite candidate in June, August, or November, you can be an election protection worker, and that is a nonpartisan group. And it just assures that the voting at that particular polling location is running smoothly. And if it is not, if people are having difficulty voting, whether it be equipment breaking down, not on the rolls, all those kinds of things, you call into an 800 number, and there are attorneys that help fix that issue, kind of a central clearinghouse. And so that's something else that I did. So if you don't have a candidate that you're going to be standing and supporting, think about taking a shift and being an election protection worker, which just protects all of our elections. And that's something that the Advancement Project and the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition organizes for us. So shout out to them.
Well, and let me just say, we are going to be it's very likely that election protection is going to be revamping as a result of that. And just to sort of clarify a couple things, election protection is a national effort. It is the nation's largest nonpartisan monitoring coalition, Missouri Voter Protection for the state of Missouri. At the national level, it's actually convened by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, not Advancement Project. So we do anticipate, even though our initial work plan called for a great expansion of the number of monitors we had at polling places, at the national level, we were revamping some of that a little bit, but the hotline will still be live. And we will still have opportunities for everyone to volunteer. And that hotline is live now. Anyone across the country can call it, 866-OUR-VOTE, and it is answered by attorneys that can answer any sort of questions related to your voting status year round.
Wonderful, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I've kind of been going through the chat and kind of highlighting ones that I've seen. Feel free to type anything else you have in the chat, or I think you can each unmute yourself individually if you do have a question that you want to share.
Yes, hello, this is Jake Lionfields with the West County Community Action Network. I had a question, and I appreciated Denise answering this question in the chat. I had a follow-up. The question was about which kind of prosecutors would prosecute folks who attempt to cast an absentee ballot despite maybe not having 100%, a reason that's 100% matched up with one of the several reasons that you, one of the several excuses you can make to vote absentee. And she answered that county prosecutors would be the ones who would prosecute those situations. And I know that it might not be the case that there's a strong incentive for county prosecutors to prosecute those, I guess, technically crimes. But it is worth noting that in Texas, the state attorney general did issue a statement trying to discourage people from similarly making an excuse when seeking to vote via absentee or mail by mail. And so I guess I wonder if another action we can take as citizens is to encourage local county prosecutors to issue a statement saying that in light of the pandemic, they will deprioritize prosecuting anybody who seeks to vote absentee. Because I know, Trish, when you and I were speaking before, people did express worry to you, your constituents expressed worry to you that they might be prosecuted for giving what might not be 100% clear match for the reason they're seeking to vote absentee. So it's just a thought, and I wondered, Denise and or Trish, if you could weigh in on whether that's a good course of action for us as citizens.
Yeah, I mean, already a number of prosecutors have said that here's what we know. So right now, let me just step back. Making a false statement on an absentee ballot application is a Class C felony. It is punishable potentially by prison time, a significant fine. It is also considered a criminal violation associated with the right of suffrage, which means that if you are convicted, you lose the right to vote for the rest of your life. So you lose eligibility to vote for the rest of your life in Missouri. So it's a serious offense, but I will say that it is rarely prosecuted, and there are many local election authorities that don't refer such cases for prosecution, but that doesn't mean that they can't. And here's who can. A local election official who gets that absentee ballot application, if they have reason to believe that it's fraudulently procured, they can refer that to a local county prosecutor. The Secretary of State's office also has an investigations division. And if they believe that there is a violation of any election law, they can also refer to county prosecutors. Prosecutors have discretion to decide when to prosecute. And so even though, what I want to say is that even though such cases are rarely prosecuted, it doesn't mean that the prospect of prosecution isn't there. And that's going to be true even if prosecutors say, hey, this isn't going to be a priority for me. And that prospect of prosecution is enough to create deterrence, particularly for populations that don't have much confidence in the word of a prosecutor, right? Especially for populations that are over-policed, over-prosecuted. And that's where the deterrence piece comes in. And those folks simply say, you know what, I don't want to be subject to additional scrutiny. I'm just going to sit this one out. And so that's why there needs to be a guarantee that that people are able to cast a ballot without fear of potential prosecution. Though certainly, I think it's been valuable to see various officials, including prosecutors, saying this isn't going to be a priority for us to prosecute. But the truth of the matter is, as long as this law is still on the books, it's still on the books.
Yeah, Rick Stream echoed that when I asked about that, because I said people had communicated to me, you know, I am anxious about COVID-19, but none of these boxes say that. So which one do I pick? And he basically said, you just pick the one that you think most closely aligns with how you might be feeling on that day, and nothing's going to happen. So not going to be a priority, at least in June.
So this is Karen. So the mailing that a lot of St. Louis County people have already received, they can be confident that they can check box 2 because they are 60 or older and they can submit an absentee ballot without a notary. Is that correct?
So again, I'll speak. I can kind of speak to that. I did spend quite a bit of time on the phone with St. Louis County election officials on this. So, like I said, Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft has not taken a position on whether or not social distancing and fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 constitutes a valid reason. So he's leaving it up to local election officials. St. Louis County has taken a public position that people can assert that under their discretion. Other election jurisdictions have said, no, you can't. Other election jurisdictions have said, well, you might be able to, but only under certain circumstances, okay? So St. Louis County has taken the position of sending letters, particularly to people that are in certain high-risk groups, like voters over 60, encouraging them to adopt that option. So again, that's applicable, that's using their discretion within St. Louis County. That doesn't mean that St. Louis City is going to accept that. And that doesn't mean that St. Charles County is going to accept that, or that Jackson County is going to accept that, or that Greene County is going to accept that.
Thanks, Denise.
I was wondering, is there a state association of election officials that have addressed this issue? I mean, they usually meet together, don't they, and come up with guidance on all kinds of things?
Yes. The Missouri Association of County Clerks is an association of the local election officials in the state of Missouri. And again, as I mentioned, there is no consensus amongst the local election authorities on whether social distancing and fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 constitutes a valid excuse to vote absentee. However, I will say this, the Clerks Association has taken a position on no excuse absentee voting, and they have endorsed it. They are supporting legislation that was introduced and actually passed out of the House Elections Committee earlier this year that would establish no excuse absentee voting. And that was endorsed by Republican and Democrat local election authorities. But again, so far, there's not any consistent viewpoint amongst local election authorities about whether fear of contracting or spreading COVID-19 constitutes a valid reason to vote absentee. Again, that's why we anticipate that it's going to require a court order to get that established statewide.
Right. And those things it can be voted out of committee, but it's up to the speaker and the floor leader to decide what makes it onto the House floor for debate. So if it doesn't come onto the floor, it's not going to become law.
Denise, did you see that last question in the chat box?
Yes, thank you. Elad asks, is there a list somewhere of which counties have said they will accept the pandemic as an excuse? And I was just kind of replying to that. So there has been a request sent to every local election authority. I think most of them have, but not all of them have responded. And some of those responses have been included in media. I do not know if the full list has been made public, but there are several. I can try and find a site. Jason Hancock published an article in the Kansas City Star on Wednesday, listing some of the responses, county to county.
I don't actually have a question more, and I did put this in the chat too, but I do want to just put this out here. I live in Ferguson, and we work very hard on our school board campaign to get very local with it all here in the Ferguson Florissant School District. And in the last 2 years, our polling places have been changed, including this election, we think 3 times, because we've been told they are likely going to change again and the numbers reduced. And this is just really concerning. I know this time there's some really good reasons for it, you know, obviously with the pandemic and everything, we can understand that. But the last time they were changed, it also seemed like a pretty good reason why they might need to change it, and the time before. And it's just too much of a trend, I feel like, to ignore, because we know that that's such a kind of classic voter suppression tactic, to change polling places to reduce the numbers and so on. So I just want to put that out there. I don't know if anyone has any insight or anything to say about that, but I just want to put it out there so it becomes known. Thank you.
I appreciate your comment, because you're right. I mean, and even outside of this crisis, you know, getting back to sort of the meta picture about voting, closing and consolidation of polling places has, you're absolutely right, become a voter suppression tactic overall in recent years. And certainly issues related to the pandemic that may mandate changes of polling places for very good reasons, right? We don't want polling places at senior centers, right? We don't want them in schools. Only sort of adds to that. And that is why our policies very, very strongly call on very significant advance notice and robust outreach and communication to voters, because voting is about habit. And what we know from political scientists and social science data research is that anytime you change the rules in any way or change how people vote, it deters people from participating, particularly if they don't feel confident that they really know what to do and what the rules are. So that notice is absolutely critical. And again, that's really a way that all of us as advocates can play a really important role, helping ensure that people have access to the information they need to feel confident that they have the tools they need to cast a ballot.
I just want to add that in my special election, polls were consolidated, and we started telling people to really pay attention to those notices that they get in the mail. You get those and you know there's an election, but I don't check to see where my polling location is typically. And so I think that's a messaging that we're going to all have to start saying to folks, is be sure and really read both sides and see where your polling location is, because they're likely to change. They're moving things away from schools, places where you have better parking, access, those kinds of things. So that was just a message that we, kept at it.
Anybody else have any other final questions? Wonderful. Representative or Denise, do you have any other final thoughts that you want to share with us before we close out today?
Go ahead, Denise.
Sure. I guess I just want to sort of step back and say, this is a scary time, and we're all anxious, and we're anxious about a lot of things, including voting, and we have reason to be, because this pandemic is going to affect our ability to access democracy. But I want to say this: we can ensure the proper functioning of our democracy in this state in 2020. We have the tools to do it. Even just ensuring that all people have access to absentee voting without a notary is going to go a very, very long way. We have the tools to do it. Our leaders may not have the political will to do it, but we have the tools to do it. And I really am confident that between us all, with our advocacy, with the outreach that we're going to do with voters, and potentially with the help of the courts as well, that we'll be able to ensure that all people will be able to cast a ballot. And I just want to put again, please, I hope that you will sign up to get notices from the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, because we do post a lot of the resources that I referred to in some of my comments earlier today from both the state and the national level. You can text MOVPC to 66866 to get on that email list. Thank you.
I just want to echo what Denise said. It is a very, these are uncertain times, scary times. I have 2 healthcare professionals in my family. My daughter is on the COVID floor at Barnes. And so obviously this affects me and my family greatly. So I'm just mindful of everybody out there who is on the front line today, whether it be in hospitals, in grocery stores, gas stations. I mean, any of those essential businesses, all the work that folks are doing. So everybody stay well, stay safe, wear your mask, wear your gloves. But it is going to change things. I mean, from a candidate's perspective, and as a representative, I really don't even consider myself as much a candidate now as a representative. I feel like that's what I should be doing, is finding out from my constituents the needs they might have, and I'm in conversation with them on a regular basis, actively talking to folks, checking in, wanting to hear how people are doing, and voting is one big piece of that. And I mentioned, folks, when those letters landed in mailboxes, I heard from people. And so it matters. They're excited. They want to still retain that right. And we need to just make it as easy as possible and continue putting pressure on the governor, the Secretary of State, and whoever represents you, because trust me, that makes a difference. And I know it can be arduous and, over and over again, calling, emailing, it makes a difference. So aside from that, just engage yourself and become a part of this movement, whatever that looks like, because as I mentioned before, as a citizen, you can do just as much as, if not more. While we may legislate and do the law, it's the input that we receive from our constituents that really helps direct me in what I do, and I would imagine my colleagues as well. So I'm so excited so many folks showed up today, and really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This was an excellent presentation. So I'm still learning some of this technology stuff. I'm hoping I've recorded this correctly and I can somehow figure out how to put it on our website. And I'm hoping on whatever location on our website that has the recording, I'll also be able to include some links to the Missouri Voter Protection website, to maybe the sign-on link, and to other links that we've talked about today. So check on our website here next week to get some of that information. I don't know exactly where it's going to go or how that exactly will work, but my hope and goal is by the beginning of next week, all of that will be available on our website. And that website is www.empowermissouri.org. And if you click on there, you should be able to find all of this information, this recording, and all of those links, hopefully by next week. So yet again, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And let's continue to be in touch on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Empower Missouri.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.